Welcome back to another edition of The Daily Lift. And today I want to talk to you about establishing your faith. We see this term in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 2. When Paul is held up in Athens, Satan is hindering him. He's trying to get to the church in Thessalonica, and he can't stand it any longer. So he sends Timothy, and he sends him to encourage and establish their faith. And he says, I sent Timothy, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith. This word establish here means to set up on a firm or permanent basis. And I have a plant nursery. And in our plant nursery, this is a place where we keep plants that are propagated and grown until they make it to a usable size. This is an area where plants are grown for transplanting. They're used for stocks for budding and grafting and just to sell in general. And in our nursery, we have at least 3 phases before our plants are deemed worthy to use or to sell. So first we have a hothouse or a greenhouse. This is something that is completely sheltered from the elements. These delicate plants and cuttings can easily be killed. They need a lot of high attention. They can easily dry out also. Then we have a shade house. This is a little more sheltered, a little less than the hothouse, but it's a little more sheltered than just the out in the open. It's shaded, it's sheltered from the harsh elements, mostly the sun, but a little bit of rain as well. So the plants are progressing along, but they still can't stand completely by themselves. It can take in more nutrients, and we see some growth, but it still needs our attention and care. And then we have the hardening off phase, which is outsized. This is exposed fully to all the elements. They still require attention, and they're not at a fruit producing point yet, but they're nearly ready to be planted and to really start taking those roots. And then after this, they become usable. They're taken to their permanent environment, and they're able to take root, produce fruit, and they're able to be propagated to produce more plants, more fruit, and the cycle goes on and on. And so in our Christian walks, we can see many similarities to this. As newborn babes, we're just starting out. We're like these seedlings in the hothouse. In 1 Peter 2:2, he says, as newborn babes, desire the pure milk of the word, that you may grow thereby. So at this stage, they can easily lose their spiritual lives. They need a lot of attention, a lot of encouragement, and there is much for them to take in, and they must be supplied this. It's more difficult for them to seek it out themselves. And so when we move on to the meatier matters, we have a little more understanding, a little more learning. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 2, Paul says to the church in Corinth, I fed you with milk and not with solid food. For until now, you are not able to receive it. And even now, you're still not able. And so we still see that at this phase, they need a lot of attention. They're in the shade house now, and they're a little less fragile, but it's still difficult to stand up on their own. And beginning to connect the dots here and gain knowledge and a bit of wisdom and experience is all part of this process. And they're not yet able to produce a lot of fruit, but there's definitely noticeable growth here. And then we move on to being able to feast on the meat of the word. Hebrews 5:12 tells us, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracle of God, that you have become to need milk and not solid food. So now we have this idea of they're maturing nicely. They're out in the elements. They're able to stand on their own, but attention is still required. Encouragement is still needed and necessary, but the fruit production is still not all there. More experience is needed. More growth is needed. And then we are brought to full maturity. In Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 8, Jeremiah says, he shall be like a tree planted by the waters, which spreads out its roots by the river, and will not fear when the heat comes, but its leaf will be green, and will not be anxious in the year of drought, nor will cease from yielding fruit. We see here at full maturity, we can stand out on our own. We are producing fruit, and there isn't much that can hinder us at this point. Sadly, though, like the scriptures are telling us that we just read, there are many who should be progressing farther than they actually are. If you go to a plant nursery, you may see these kind of plants that are left behind. They're left in the shade house. They're still alive, but they're root bound. They're thin and spindly. You may see a tree in an extra large pot that has some signs of maturity, but they can't really get as big as they need to be or produce as much fruit as they could without being moved into the ground and have planted roots who are actually established. And so I want to ask you this. Where are you along in your walk? Are you where you should be? Or are you root bound and spindly and barren? We see that Jesus says a lot about plants and about trees. And he says this about those who do not produce the good fruit. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 19, he says, every tree that does not bear good fruit, it's cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits, you will know them. So I want you to encourage others and help them become established. One of the ways to do this is to be an established position yourself. There's a good reason why when we're in an airplane and they talk about the emergencies, they tell you to secure your oxygen mask first. We've got to take care of ourselves first to be in a position to help others. So let us strive to be like the tree that Jeremiah speaks about, so that when those times of drought come, we're not anxious and we don't fear. We're able to continue to produce fruit year after year. Go lift somebody up.